now reached our last region for this semester, talking about Oceania. Similar learning objectives looking at those geographic features. New term here that we'll talk about, biogeography. We'll come back to climate change, and then of course talk about the history and the settlement of this region. So first of all, Oceania, mainly we think about Australia down here, but then also a lot of other islands that make up this region as well. We can essentially put this region into three smaller regions. So we have Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And they're made up of these various islands that come together to make up Oceania. So again, Australia here, New Zealand make up Australia, Asia. Horrible pronunciation there, sorry. And then Melanesia, we have a few other islands that you probably have heard of, so like Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands that are in here, Fiji, very popular tourist destination. And then the other islands are a little less known. We do have Guam over here as well. And then actually Hawaii is part of this. So of course it's part of the United States, but as far as our regions, it's actually part of the Polynesian Islands. So again, these three distinct regions that are here, but again, they're made up of islands, and just to kind of put it in perspective, micro, we think about small, but whenever you think about the number of islands, it actually has about 2,000 islands that make them up, and you can see from this, many of them are extremely small islands, but again, they come together to make up this Micronesia. Again, the Polynesia, which is where Hawaii is, and then our Melanesia, which is where Fiji and some of the more popular islands are, in addition, of course, to Australia and New Zealand. A little video here that kind of goes over this region as well, that is a good watch. So if we look at these Pacific islands, so they're separated into high islands and low islands, and as the name implies, it's based on elevation. So high islands are volcanic, so they're going to have some higher elevations. Low islands are more coral, so we think about our reefs, but those islands are made up particularly of coral, so they're not going to have very high elevation, whereas the volcanic, and again, the term high indicating that high elevation or high relief is another term that's used to talk about the distance in elevation. Again, low islands with that low elevation. Now the volcanic islands give rise to fertile soil, so lots of vegetation, lots of agriculture can occur there, whereas the low islands with that coral base are very dry and sandy, so not great for a lot of vegetation. High islands, again, also have ample rainfall, helps add to that fertile soil to provide agriculture, whereas the low islands are more of our like tropical islands we think about, so less fresh water that is there, which again is going to decrease the population of those islands because they don't have a lot of resources. All right, so again, larger populations due to that vegetation, better rainfall, just more suitable for living, whereas low islands have smaller populations for the opposite reasons. Also, these low islands, we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, are also more vulnerable to natural disasters. So we think about tsunamis in those, because of those lower islands, it doesn't take much to cover them and to cause more severe damage. All right, so the climate, again, we typically think about kind of warm tropical climate in these islands. Little extremes, again, we've talked about before, the closer we are to water, the less extremes we have because it's more temperate. The water maintains a rather constant temperature that controls and has a more temperate or constant climate. So of course, all these are surrounded by water, so it makes sense that they have more temperate climates. Also, the term maritime climate, which is what we see in New Zealand and Australia, and what that means is they just kind of have cooler summers and winters, so we don't think about the hot summers like we have. Again, a little cooler in the summer and winters, and again, few extreme temperatures or rainfall. So pretty moderate kind of constant climate. Now the term biogeography that I said we would kind of introduce here. So this explores the spatial distribution of the world's biology. So bio meaning life. So we're talking about plant life, which is the flora, and then fauna, which is the animal life. So Oceania, just like we talked about with the Amazon rainforest in South America, very biodiverse. So not to the extreme as the Amazon rainforest, but this region is extremely diverse in its plants and animals. So some organisms only live in this region. So again, there are different plants, different animals that you would only find living in Oceania. So if we kind of look at some of these, go ahead and Google, look up, see if you can find 3 of them or so, just to kind of ease your curiosity, perhaps. But some of them that we see are called monotremes. And these are mammals that lay eggs instead of giving birth. So they're still mammals. They have mammary glands. They produce milk. They nurse their young. However, they don't have live birth. So they lay eggs instead of giving birth. So for example, our little platypus down here is a monotreme. So it's hypothesized that they are only in Oceania because of the isolation. So again, if we think about, Pangea being all connected here, but then as they start moving away, Australia became very, very isolated. So no land bridges to connect these areas. So again, most of these are extinct because they've been outcompeted by those giving birth to live, or actually giving birth rather than laying eggs. Of course, the eggs then are susceptible to predators or the environment. Again, the isolation, though, in this region has prevented that out competition. So in this example, some of these organisms are still alive because of how isolated they were in this region. So they couldn't be outcompeted because there weren't as many of these organisms giving birth rather than laying eggs. Some others, marsupials. So of course, whenever we think about Australia, most people think about the kangaroo and the koala, Tasmanian devil as well. But these marsupials are also predominantly only, some of them only in Oceania. So again, these are mammals that carry their young in their pouch. Again, most diverse population in Oceania. Again, some only living in this region, but others, marsupials can be found other places. For example, possums, the only ones that we have in North America. They're also home to some of the deadliest animals in a range of aquatic organisms like our jellyfish. Here, various poisonous snakes, of course, the tarantula. But again, lots of deadly animals in this region. So there are more deadly snakes in Australia than any other country. So for example, the taipan is the most venomous snake. It's where you would find it. Again, various spiders like the tarantula, of course. There's actually an episode of Peppa Pig, if you're familiar with the kids show, in Australia. This is in New Zealand as well, but there's an episode of Peppa Pig where there's like this friendly spider, and so they actually banned just that episode, not the whole show, but just that episode of Peppa Pig, because they don't want to have kids thinking that spiders could in any way be friendly, because they want them to steer clear of them. And then the box jellyfish, which is the other picture that's shown here, again, very venomous if stung by this. So kind of moving on now to climate change. So of course, our causes of climate change in this region, again, climate change due to an increase in carbon dioxide, predominantly also methane, that traps more of that heat. Of course, that allows us to live on Earth. It keeps our climate warm, but as we get too many greenhouse gases, it's making it a bit too warm. So some of the reasons and causes and impacts that this region has on climate change. So the outback is being used for grazing rather than, so that's decreasing the crops. It's illegal logging in Papua New Guinea, so that deforestation, decreasing are plants that suck up a lot of that carbon dioxide, the pollution from dairying in New Zealand. So quite a few videos down here at the bottom to click on. But the dairy cow production, just the amount of methane and carbon dioxide that it gets released during the production of milk is extremely leads to an increased amount of those greenhouse gases and pollution. To put that in perspective, it actually takes about 1,100 liters of water to dilute just 1 liter of milk that's being produced. Also, the methane from the cows and sheep in New Zealand, again, methane is another one of those greenhouse gases. There's a large number of these in this area for that grazing that increases that methane. There are also multiple invasive weeds that are destroying the natural vegetation. Again, just changing those plant species that decreases the consumption of carbon dioxide. So Australia actually spends about $4 billion a year trying to manage those invasive species, again, to keep that biodiversity intact. And then we'll talk more about this one, but the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, due to pollution, especially of plastics, that is polluting our waters. So again, quite a few videos down here that go into more detail about each of these. So back to this Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So you can see here along this coast, it is completely littered with all of these plastics, all of this waste from the water that has come up to shore in these. And so it makes up what is called this Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So again, this trash washes up on the shores. So Camilo Beach in Hawaii is the one that's shown here. It has like the most significant amount of garbage. So it's referred to actually as the plastic beach, because even this region here where it looks like it's sand, it's actually pieces of degraded trash and plastic. So about 90% of it is actually bits of plastic rather than sand. You actually have to dig about a foot down to get to the sand. That's how thick this layer of garbage is. So of course this creates a lot of hazard for the marine life that can destroy and damage their ecosystem. That makes it harder for them to live, and then that impacts other ecosystems as well. So the management and cleanup, though, is a challenge because the debris comes from all over. It's not like it just comes from this island here in Hawaii. It's from multiple, again, we think about ships, we think about different islands, we think about just different sources of this pollution. So it's hard to manage it and hard to clean it up. Right, so now that we've talked about some of the effects here, or some of the causes of the climate change in this area, now looking at the effects. So just small increases in the temperature, the ocean levels are actually very disastrous to this region because of their fragile ecosystem. So just like the Amazon rainforest, where there's so much biodiversity and there are organisms that only live in those areas, well, the reason is because their climate is just right. So small changes to that could destroy those habitats. So coral bleaching, again, a video here if you're more interested in that, especially the Great Barrier Reef that is found in this region. So the bleaching is where, again, it's turning white. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead. It is definitely hurting those coral systems that then change the habitat for the organisms that rely on that for hiding and for food. And then the increase in sea levels. So again, we think about especially the low islands. So we're actually losing complete populations of individuals that have to relocate. Again, video that talks more about that. But it's making many of the islands inhabitable. So these people that live on these islands are having to find new homes and relocate. And they're poor islands anyways. So coming up with the funds to move and relocate is very challenging. Because again, these are low islands, so think about tsunamis or increases in sea level are covering these islands up. All right, now kind of switching over to the history of this region. Again, a video here that kind of goes through it. Our globe here shows essentially kind of the time scale and just where the colonization and the inhabitation of these islands came from. So the Aboriginal Australians are the indigenous individuals of this region. So they arrived about 40 to 50,000 years ago. This was whenever the sea levels were lower at that time. There were more land bridges. So the islands were a lot closer together. So they were able to travel a little easier than what they can today. Now the Polynesian Islands in New Zealand are actually the last to be settled. So again, our Polynesian are the ones over here, including Hawaii, but then on New Zealand as well. Even though it's one of the larger ones, it was one of the last to be settled. And this was due to increased advances in sea transportation that allowed them to be discovered and populated. And there are many different, because of this ethno-linguistics, so think about ethnic cultures as well as different languages and cultural groups in this region today. Because again, they were inhabited by different individuals, many of them maybe leaving one island to set up, their own cultural beliefs or their own system. So again, lots of diversity, not just with plants and animals, but also with people and cultures. So the European settlement in Australia, so it actually became one of the British prison colonies. So individuals, and it wasn't necessarily just the worst of the worst, but it was just people since kind of overcrowding of prisons in Britain, they were sent to Australia to the prison system. The Dutch actually landed in Australia about 1606 AD, explored and mapped the area. The first Australian settlement, again, European settlement, though, was not until the late 18th century. That's what today is now Sydney. And again, it was to set up that prison colony. And about 20% of Australians are actually descendants from those imprisoned settlers. So again, these weren't hardened criminals. So many of them ended up staying. Of course, they interacted with the natives of the island. So again, lots of descendants actually came from imprisoned settlers. This did challenge, just like we've seen in many of our regions, including the United States, it challenged the indigenous individuals, so not only the Aboriginal land, but also their water sources. The disease, of course, was most devastating. About 315 to 750,000 Aboriginal people. Again, hard to determine the exact number of that group before colonization, but it went down to only 74,000. So huge impact on disease by introduction from the European settlers. And then actually Australia dissolved from British control, relatively recent as far as history goes, in 1942, became an independent country. So settlement of the other regions besides Australia, again, New Zealand is one of the colonies of Australia, became its own colony though in the mid-19th century. This Treaty of Waitangi, this is granted the British colonists sovereignty over governing their land. So this is a really odd kind of setup. So it gave the Maori their tribal lands and resources, but also made them British subjects. So they were free, but not free. So they could have their land and their resources, but they were still under the control of the British people. So then the European and Japanese colonial expeditions claimed most of the Pacific islands. So not only Europe, but here's where Japan actually comes into play. So they settled many of the regions and had expeditions to these different islands. So between the 19th and 20th century, so the reason for this is those strategic military bases. Of course, we think about with World War II and Japan bombing Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. So again, these islands kind of in between are good military bases, just like Britain had set up those prison colonies, but also all the different resources became good trade opportunities and resource opportunities. Now, after World War II, though, many of the islands gained their independence. Others are still colonies of either Japan or Europe, but many of them are independent countries. Now, the economy of this region, again, mainly looking at Australia and New Zealand as far as being part of kind of global players, but essentially they struggle due to their distance. So that isolation and that increased cost of transportation, kind of this tyranny of distance. So there are higher export costs due to that transportation. So they have lots of resources. It's just hard to get them, to get them places. So Australia's economy is mainly based on those exports. And again, we have all this added transportation costs to get it places. So geography plays a key role in that. They do have significant natural resources to share. It's just getting them places. Now the population compared to its size, though, is small. So again, if we think about the number of people that live in this region and compare it to the resources, there are more resources than there are people. So they have lots of extra that they can export. So that has allowed them to be a leader in especially coal exports, second largest in diamond mines in the world. So again, they have a lot of resources to share. It's just getting them places. And they do have these import substitution industries, so more like a trade where they can import and export and kind of offset some of those costs. So this replaces again those imports with domestic production, so they don't have to import as much because they can rely on their own resources. Now, some of the smaller islands have more limited resources, especially the lower islands where they don't have that fertile soil. They're coral kind of, so they don't have mines or anything like that. So those smaller islands definitely have limited resources. Again, even more remote, so making them harder to gain access. So many rely on trade with Australia and New Zealand, but also with China, Japan, and the US. So they can export to get income and then import the goods they need. Tourism, though, definitely is becoming a significant source of income. So we think about Fiji, but a lot of those other islands are being discovered, and tourism becomes their main resource. This, however, has been drastically impacted, especially the smaller islands, by climate change. So again, actually starting to remove people and cause them to have to relocate due to the increased rise in sea level that is destroying their habitats.